When police pulled the trigger on a Latino colonel, they thought it was over, until 80 soldiers arrived armed, furious, and ready to demand justice. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the tall buildings of downtown Phoenix, painting the streets in long golden shadows. Traffic was sluggish, the air dry, and people hurried along the sidewalks with the restlessness that came from a long, hot day. On the corner of Jefferson Avenue, a man in a neatly pressed shirt and tan slacks exited a modest diner, his gait steady, disciplined. His name was Colonel Alejandro Ramirez, a decorated Latino officer who had served the United States Army for over 25 years. Despite his strong build and commanding presence, there was humility in the way Alejandro moved. He carried his food in a simple paper bag, nodding politely to the waitress who had served him, and paused for a moment to let a group of teenagers cross the street. He had returned from deployment just 3 weeks ago and was still adjusting to civilian rhythms. But fate doesn't care for medals, discipline, or quiet dignity. A few blocks away, 2 patrol officers received a frantic radio call. Armed suspect, Latino male, late 40s, beige shirt, possibly exiting a diner near Jefferson Avenue. Their hearts raced with adrenaline. They had been on edge all week due to rising crime in the area. Neither officer bothered to clarify or request backup. They simply drove straight toward the location. When Alejandro turned the corner onto a quieter street, heading for his parked car, the screech of tires ripped through the air. A police cruiser jerked to a halt and 2 officers leapt out, weapons drawn. "Hands where I can see them, now," one shouted, his voice trembling more from tension than authority. Alejandro froze, stunned, the bag of food slipping from his hand. "Officers, there must be a mistake. I said hands up." The colonel raised his hands slowly, instinctively calm under pressure, just as he had trained countless young soldiers to remain calm under fire. "I am unarmed," he said evenly, his accent laced with both dignity and fatigue. But the officers weren't listening. In their eyes, they didn't see a decorated U.S. Army colonel who had commanded troops overseas and saved countless lives. They saw only the echo of the dispatch call and the color of his skin. One officer stepped closer, weapon trembling. Alejandro tried to speak again, his tone respectful but firm. "Please check my identification in my pocket. I am Colonel Alejandro Ramirez, U.S. Army." The moment was razor-thin, a fragile line between reason and chaos. And then, bang! The shot tore through the silence, echoing down the street. Alejandro stumbled backward, clutching his side, eyes wide in disbelief. His knees buckled as he collapsed onto the pavement, blood staining his shirt. The officers froze, realizing too late the gravity of what they had done. One whispered, almost horrified at himself, "Oh my God, what did we just do?" Alejandro gasped, fighting for breath, the weight of his years of service flashing before him. Comrades lost in battle, missions survived, promises kept. And now here he was, shot down not by an enemy overseas but by the very people sworn to protect him at home. As sirens wailed faintly in the distance, the younger officer panicked. We'll say he reached for something." He matched the description. "We'll fix it." But it was already too late, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that Alejandro was not alone in this city. He had just returned from deployment. Yes. But 80 of his soldiers, men and women who had served under his command, who owed him their lives, were also in town. They had gathered that weekend for a private reunion. These soldiers were not just comrades. They were family. They were fiercely loyal. And when one of them was hurt, the rest moved like a unit. Word travels fast in military circles, faster than any police radio could keep up with. As Colonel Ramirez lay bleeding on the pavement, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Messages from his men who had been expecting him at the gathering. When he didn't show, one of them tracked his location. And within minutes, the streets around Jefferson Avenue would no longer belong to the Phoenix PD. They would belong to 80 battle-hardened soldiers, armed, trained, and ready to defend the honor of the man who had led them through fire and war. The police officers still hovered, hands shaking, realizing the enormity of what they had done. But when the rumble of multiple vehicles approached from all sides, their fear shifted. It wasn't backup. It was something far, far worse. The city blocks near Jefferson Avenue had always been filled with the hum of ordinary life. Street vendors calling out, buses hissing to a stop, neighbors chatting on stoops. But now, As the late afternoon light dimmed, an uneasy silence descended. The two officers hovered over Colonel Alejandro Ramirez's bleeding body, panic tightening their throats. The older cop radioed frantically for backup. His voice cracked as he reported, "Shots fired. Officer-involved shooting. Suspect down. Requesting immediate medical and police support." I didn't dare say the truth that the suspect had identified himself as a U.S. Army. Colonel, moments before the trigger was pulled. The younger officer paced in short, frantic strides, muttering under his breath, "We're screwed, we're so screwed." And then, like thunder rolling in from every direction, the sound of engines shattered the silence. Black SUVs, military-style jeeps, and even civilian trucks came pouring into the narrow streets. Their headlights flared in the dusk, trapping the officers in a blinding circle of light. Doors slammed open in perfect unison. One by one, men and women stepped out. Uniformed soldiers in combat fatigues, their boots pounding the asphalt in disciplined rhythm. Some carried sidearms holstered at their belts, others held rifles slung across their shoulders. In total, there were nearly 80 of them, spreading out with precision, encircling the scene. The air turned electric. Civilians on the sidewalks froze, whispering in disbelief. Some pulled out their phones, recording what would soon flood social media. A small army materializing in the middle of a city street. The older officer's jaw went slack. His weapon trembled in his hand. What the hell is this?" From the crowd of soldiers, a tall figure emerged. Major Marcus Steele, Ramirez's second in command. A man with sharp features, a rigid jawline, and the kind of commanding presence that silenced even the noisiest room. He strode forward, eyes locked on the bleeding colonel. "Medic, now!" Two soldiers instantly broke formation, rushing forward with tactical medical packs. They knelt beside Alejandro, cutting open his blood-soaked shirt and applying pressure to the wound. One whispered, "Stay with us, sir. You don't get to check out here. Not like this." Alejandro's lips trembled, voice faint but firm. "Stand down, Marcus," but Marcus wasn't listening. His eyes shifted to the two officers who now stood frozen, surrounded by armed soldiers with expressions of controlled fury. "Who fired the shot?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp as steel. The younger officer stammered, his throat dry. I thought he matched the description. You shot an unarmed man." Marcus cut him off coldly. His voice rose, booming across the street. "Not just any man. A colonel of the United States Army. A man who has bled for this country more times than you've probably saluted the flag." The crowd of soldiers erupted with angry murmurs, their boots shifting, rifles tightening in their grips. The younger officer raised his hands instinctively, sweat streaming down his forehead. Please, I didn't know." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. "You didn't know because you didn't care to look. You didn't listen. You heard a dispatch description and thought that gave you the right to play executioner." The older officer tried to step in, his voice quivering. We called for backup. Let's not make this worse. The medics are coming and—" Marcus snapped his head toward him, venom in his tone. Worse? You've already made it worse. Do you have any idea who this man is? He has led us through hell. He has buried brothers and sisters so this country could live free. And you shot him like he was nothing." The silence that followed was suffocating. Civilians on the sidewalks covered their mouths, some whispering prayers. The weight of 80 soldiers' eyes pressed down on the two officers, until they looked like small, helpless men drowning in their own mistakes. Then, from the formation, a female sergeant stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Colonel Ramirez carried me out of an ambush when I had a bullet in my leg. He saved my life. And now some beat cop thinks he can take his?" Another soldier barked. "Where's the justice in that?" The crowd of soldiers pressed in closer, their fury palpable, the air vibrating with tension. The officers' radios crackled uselessly, backup still miles away. Marcus raised a hand, commanding silence among his troops. His voice dropped to a low growl. "We don't spill blood in the streets unless we have to. But you two better pray Colonel Ramirez survives, because if he doesn't—" He let the sentence hang heavy in the air, unfinished yet fully understood. The younger officer's knees buckled. He dropped his weapon and raised his hands higher, tears welling in his eyes. "Please, I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't mean to." The medics lifted Alejandro onto a stretcher, his face pale but still conscious. His eyes fluttered open briefly and he rasped, "Don't retaliate. That's not who we are." But Marcus's jaw clenched. His loyalty to his colonel was absolute, yet the rage of his soldiers was a wildfire barely contained. They were trained warriors bound by discipline, but grief and fury had a way of loosening control. The sound of distant sirens grew louder. More police cruisers were on the way. Helicopter blades began chopping through the air above, spotlight beams searching the streets. Marcus turned to his men. Hold formation. Nobody fires unless I give the order. But if they make one wrong move on us while our colonel is bleeding out, we will remind them exactly who they are dealing with. The soldiers tightened ranks, weapons at the ready. The city had become a powder keg, seconds from igniting. And for the first time in decades, the Phoenix Police Department realized they weren't the ones in control. They were staring down an army. The streets of downtown Phoenix were no longer ordinary. Blue and red sirens flashed against the brick buildings as more police cruisers screamed to a halt from every direction. Officers spilled out, forming lines with weapons drawn, their training clashing with their confusion. From above, a helicopter hovered, its spotlight flooding the intersection in harsh white light. But the ground belonged to the soldiers, 80 strong, their boots rooted, their bodies forming a wall around the stretcher carrying Colonel Alejandro Ramirez. Their formation wasn't chaotic, it was organized, military precise. Civilians watched from rooftops and sidewalks, phones capturing every second. The feeds already spreading like wildfire across social media. On one side, nearly 100 police officers, sweating beneath their bulletproof vests, fingers hovering nervously over triggers. On the other, 80 battle-hardened soldiers armed, calm, and radiating the kind of discipline that comes only from combat. The tension was a wire pulled so tight, it could snap at any breath. The first to speak was the Phoenix police chief, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair who stepped forward, his hands raised in a pacifying gesture. He shouted over the sirens, "This is Chief Donovan!" "Soldiers, stand down. This is police jurisdiction. You have no authority here." From the soldiers' ranks, Major Marcus Steele stepped forward, shoulders squared, voice booming like a general on the battlefield. "No authority? You shot an unarmed U.S. Army colonel. You forfeited your authority the second you pulled that trigger." A murmur rippled through the crowd of civilians. Someone shouted, "He's right." Another yelled, "They shot a hero." The narrative was turning before the police could even control it. The chief clenched his jaw. "We don't want bloodshed here. Your colonel will get medical treatment. But this standoff ends now. Lay down your weapons before someone else gets hurt." Marcus's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Someone else? The only one bleeding here is Colonel Ramirez, a man with more stars on his shoulders than your entire department combined. And you dare tell us to stand down?" Behind Marcus, the soldiers roared in agreement, their boots pounding once against the asphalt in unison. The sound was like thunder rolling across the city blocks. The officers on the front line flinched, fingers tightening on triggers. The helicopter above shifted, spotlight sweeping across the soldiers' faces. The soldiers didn't blink. They held formation, eyes burning with fury, hands steady on their weapons. Chief Donovan swallowed hard. He knew this wasn't just about control anymore. It was about survival. If one officer twitched wrong, if one soldier misread the move, Phoenix would erupt into chaos. Then, breaking through the tension, a sharp female voice rose from the soldier ranks. Sergeant Elena Cruz, her face lined with both youth and scars, stepped forward. She pointed at the two officers who had shot Ramirez. "Where are the men who fired?" she demanded. "Bring them forward." "Or we will," the crowd gasped. The officers in question shrank back, pale as ghosts. The younger one whispered to his partner, "They're going to kill us." The chief barked back across the line. "That's not how justice works. We'll handle our officers. We have internal affairs for this." Marcus cut him off like a blade. "Internal affairs? You mean the same broken system that sweeps cases like this under the rug? No, Colonel Ramirez isn't some statistic. He's our commanding officer, and justice will not be delayed." The soldiers raised their weapons slightly, the metallic clicks echoing in the night. The police mirrored the motion, rifles snapping up to aim. The crowd screamed in terror, some ducking behind cars, others too mesmerized by the unfolding standoff to move. Chief Donovan's face glistened with sweat. He had to think fast. If he gave the order to fire, dozens, maybe hundreds, would die. If he ordered retreat, his department would look weak, but Marcus wasn't bluffing. The soldiers were ready to fight, not because they wanted blood, but because loyalty bound them tighter than any badge or bureaucratic chain of command ever could. The colonel stirred weakly on the stretcher, his voice hoarse but commanding. "Marcus," he whispered. "Don't escalate." Marcus knelt beside him briefly, gripping his hand. "Sir, they shot you. They disrespected you. We can't let that stand." Alejandro's eyes, dim but steady, locked onto his second-in-command. "Our oath was to protect this country, not destroy it. Don't let them turn us into what they already fear." Marcus's chest heaved with conflicting rage and respect. He rose again, his jaw tightening. "Chief Donovan," he called out, "here's what's going to happen. You will arrest those 2 officers who shot Colonel Ramirez, right here, right now, in front of everyone, or the city will remember tonight as the day 80 soldiers stood against your corrupt system." The chief froze, arresting his own men on the street in front of cameras under pressure. It would be an admission of guilt that could dismantle his department. But refusing could mean a bloodbath. The younger officer broke down completely, dropping to his knees, sobbing. "Please, Chief, don't let them kill us. I didn't mean it, I swear." His partner tried to pull him up, but the weight of 80 rifles aimed in their direction was too much. The civilians began chanting, voices rising from every corner. "Justice for the Colonel! Justice for the Colonel!" The chant grew louder, rolling like a wave across the block. The chief looked around, realizing public opinion wasn't with him. Every phone camera was pointed at him, broadcasting live. If he made the wrong choice, he wouldn't just face soldiers. He'd face the wrath of the entire nation. He raised his hand reluctantly and barked at his men. "Detain those 2 officers, now!" Gasps erupted. Even the police officers hesitated, confused. But under the chief's glare, 2 of them moved forward, seizing the shooters by their arms. The younger one cried out, "No! Chief, please!" But it was drowned by the roar of the crowd. The soldiers watched, still tense, but their fingers eased off triggers as the officers were cuffed. The chant grew deafening, "Justice for the Colonel." Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders loosening, but his eyes stayed hard. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. "Not until Colonel Ramirez walks out of that hospital alive." The stretcher moved toward an ambulance, soldiers forming a protective barrier on all sides. Police backup had been neutralized not by bullets, but by the weight of truth and public outrage. But deep down, everyone knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The ambulance roared away into the night, its siren wailing, carrying Colonel Alejandro Ramirez toward the nearest trauma center. Around it, dozens of soldiers jogged in formation, forming a moving shield, refusing to let anyone but medics near their commander. Their boots struck the pavement in unison, echoing with the discipline of war. The crowd erupted into applause as they passed, civilians cheering, chanting the colonel's name. Phones streamed the scene live, hashtags exploding online. "Justice for the Colonel," "Hero shot," "Soldiers vs. Police." In less than an hour, what had begun as a tragic mistake had spiraled into a nationwide event. Behind, Chief Donovan stood frozen, watching as his 2 officers, now in cuffs, were shoved into the back of a patrol car. He could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on him. Cameras, civilians, soldiers, even his own men were silently questioning his every decision. One reporter, shoving a mic toward him, barked, "Chief, what do you say about your officers shooting an unarmed Army colonel? Do you admit this was racially motivated?" The chief's mouth opened, but no words came. His silence spoke louder than any excuse. At the hospital, chaos reigned. Doctors rushed Colonel Ramirez into surgery, his blood pressure dangerously low. Outside the operating room, Major Marcus Steele stood like a statue, arms crossed, flanked by soldiers who refused to leave. Hospital security tried to intervene at first, but one look into the soldiers' grim faces told them to stand down. Hours dragged on. Civilians crowded the hospital entrance, holding candles, flags, and handmade signs. "Our soldiers deserve better. Protect those who protect us." The media set up outside, their vans lining the streets, anchors breathlessly narrating the unfolding drama. Finally, near dawn, a weary surgeon emerged. "He's stable. The bullet missed his heart by half an inch. He'll recover with time." Relief swept through the soldiers like a wave. Some let out ragged cheers, others bowed their heads in prayer. Marcus exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Inside the room, Alejandro lay pale but conscious, tubes connected to his arms. Marcus leaned close, his eyes softer now. Sir, the whole country's watching. They saw what happened. They're calling you a hero. Alejandro's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. Heroes don't end up like this. They end up buried with flags, not you, Marcus said firmly. Not this time. By morning, the nation had erupted. Every major network carried the footage of 80 soldiers facing down police in Phoenix. Commentators debated endlessly. Was this justice or insubordination? Was it loyalty or mutiny? The president himself addressed the country from the White House. His tone was grave. We honor the service of Colonel Ramirez, who has risked his life countless times for the safety of this nation. What happened in Phoenix is unacceptable. No one, soldier or civilian, should face violence at the hands of those sworn to protect. There will be a full federal investigation, and I assure you justice will be served. The streets exploded with cheers. Protesters gathered in cities across America, holding up signs of support for the colonel and his soldiers. Military veterans joined in, their voices rising with the same demand: protect our own. Back at the Phoenix Police Department, the 2 officers who shot Ramirez sat in holding cells, pale and broken. Their names had already gone viral, their faces plastered across every screen in the country. Families of fallen soldiers sent messages of outrage, demanding accountability. Chief Donovan sat in his office, staring at resignation papers on his desk. His phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from the mayor, the governor, even the Department of Justice. His career was already over. He knew it, but this wasn't just about careers anymore. It was about the widening fracture between law enforcement and the very people they swore to protect. 2 weeks later, Colonel Ramirez stood outside the hospital, cane in hand, bandages still beneath his uniform. Behind him, dozens of his soldiers stood in formation, their eyes locked forward, their loyalty unshaken. The press swarmed him, microphones thrust forward, questions flying. He raised a hand, silencing the noise. His voice was hoarse but resolute. I did not serve this country for 25 years to see it torn apart from within. I love this nation. I love the people in it. But love requires honesty. And the truth is this: I was shot not because of who I am, but because of what I look like. That cannot continue. The crowd went silent. Ramirez's gaze hardened. Police officers who dishonor the badge dishonor the very fabric of America. But I also say this: soldiers and civilians, we are not enemies of the police. We are allies in protecting this nation. We must demand better, not with violence, but with justice, with accountability. The soldiers behind him slammed their boots once against the ground in unison, a thunderous salute that sent shivers down every spine present. The colonel's words traveled far, reaching living rooms, schools, military bases, and police stations across the country. For some, he was a symbol of unity. For others, a painful reminder of broken systems. But one thing was certain: his voice could no longer be ignored. That night, sitting in his modest home with his family, Alejandro looked out the window at the candlelight vigil burning on his front lawn. Strangers stood holding American flags and posters with his name. His daughter turned to him, tears in her eyes. Papa, they finally see you. He smiled faintly, reaching for her hand. No, amiga. They don't see me. They see the truth, and maybe now they'll fight for it. And so the story of Colonel Alejandro Ramirez became more than just a headline. It became a movement, a reckoning for a nation struggling to balance authority with justice, fear with fairness, and law with humanity. The shot fired on Jefferson Avenue had not silenced him. It had awakened millions.